Good evening and welcome to Northern Kentucky History Hour. For all of our friends joining us on Facebook and all of our friends here on Zoom, welcome. So glad to have you this evening. We are going to pause for just a moment to let all of our Zoom followers get into the meeting, and we are going to be starting momentarily. We are so happy to see you all tonight. And again, if you're just joining us, this is Northern Kentucky History Hour, a project of Behringer-Crawford Museum. And tonight we are going to have a great video for you. Just need to let all of our friends in Zoom here into the meeting, and then we will get started. All right, great. We can let more people in too if they join later. So my name is Tara Johnson-Noem, and I am your hostess for this evening, as with every week. This is Northern Kentucky History Hour with a project of Behringer-Crawford Museum. And I just have, I see a few new names in the audience, so glad to have you if you haven't joined us before. For those of you who have been with us before, welcome back. A couple of housekeeping items. You will find that your microphone is muted, but we still want to hear from you via the chat, or if you're on Facebook and you're live with us, add your questions or comments into the comments field, and then I will make note of those, and at the end of the presentation, we will try to get to everyone's question or comment in the discussion at the end. Also, do just want to make sure everybody's aware, if you are on Zoom and you have your video on, that's great. We love seeing your smiling faces, but just so you know, depending on the device that you're using, even when the screen is shared, we can probably still see you, even if you cannot see us. So I always like to let everybody know that, just in case you were, eating or doing whatever you're doing. You might want to turn your screen off if you don't want to share those activities with everybody. Let's see what else. Oh, we are so grateful to, especially tonight because of our guest, but we're always grateful for the museum staff. I'm actually just a volunteer. I have a different job that I go to every day, but the museum staff really make this possible. And so we want to say thank you to them. Thank you to all of my fellow trustees who are so committed to the museum and to Northern Kentucky's history and culture. And also thankful to the financial supporters of Behringer-Crawford Museum. So we are supported by the City of Covington, Kenton County Fiscal Court, ArtsWave, the Kentucky Arts Council, the Northern Kentucky Sports Hall of Fame, as well as the Carol Ann and Ralph V. Haile Jr. U.S. Bank Foundation. So thanks to all of them that make the museum be able to operate and open up. And it is open inside and out. And you can go to bcmuseum.org to find out more about the exhibits, the programs. Music is going to start soon. So there are so many good things. And I want to make a plug for my guest, who I'll just go ahead and introduce. We're joined tonight by Jason French. He's the curator of collections. He has a very long history working in museums and has previously been with including Cincinnati Museum Center. We are so blessed to have him at Behringer-Crawford. He also does a normal, regular programming of curators chats that you can find on the museum's Facebook page and on our YouTube channel. Fantastic programming about details about Northern Kentucky's locations and some exhibits from the museum. So if you're not already following that on YouTube, you should definitely sign up, and so that you can subscribe and see all those. They're great. So I am actually going to be, let's see, one second, sorry. I am going to be sharing Jason's slides tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and try to get that going. And Jason, why don't you introduce yourself and your topic tonight?
Good evening, everybody. I'm Jason French, and I am the curator at the museum here at Behringer-Crawford. And tonight I wanted to share with you a few things that are kind of my passion. I don't always get to study as a curator my passion because we're constantly building exhibits and we're taking in other artifacts, and I get to go into kind of depth and get excited about many, many things. But some of my passion personally is frontier history, and frontier history along the Ohio Valley and along the Ohio. Um, and through my time of working in museums, both at the Cincinnati Museum Center and then now at Behringer-Crawford, I've came across a couple of things in our region that are mysteries to me, that I think the historic documents have the previous historians and things may have gotten wrong. So I want to share with you things that I don't have all the answers to. And I may or may not ever have the answers to. And I hope that maybe we can, maybe a little bit of crowdsource. I'm hoping to inspire a few of you to get on to these mysteries and see what we can find as a group of people interested in history, to maybe better understand these topics. A little background about myself, if you've not heard me say this before. Not only am I a curator, and I've had 20 plus years in the museum field, doing a lot of living history and other kind of museum engagement, but part of the reason that I struggle with maybe finding these answers is I really don't see well, and I've got visual disabilities. So I get into these history quagmires, as it were, and I'm not able to research the way that I would love to. But over the years, I am able to come back and, I get on something for a while and then I come back. So tonight's topic is mistakes and murder in Northern Kentucky's 18th century mysteries. Now, I'm going to give you a caveat. One of the things that we're going to talk about tonight, in fact, what I'm kind of referring to as murder, didn't happen in Northern Kentucky. It happened in what's now probably Cincinnati or Hamilton County, Ohio. But so often in Kentucky history, maybe the rest of the state thinks of Northern Kentucky as Cincinnati South. Right now, for our purposes, we're going to think of Cincinnati as Northern Kentucky North. So the topic, and is the first topic I want to talk to you about, is an interesting thing that I've really been curious about for a while, and it's this defeat of Colonel David Rogers that happened probably in October of 1778. Now, what's interesting about that is the historic sources, men like Collins, the Collins History of Kentucky, and actually a number of more modern historians, because of the older resources. When we think about somebody like Collins, who's writing about the history of Kentucky, maybe 100 to 120 years ago, a little earlier, what he had to access and the resources he had at his fingertips are far different than what we have now. And we look at collections of early frontier era researchers and the men going around and documenting our frontier stories, men like I think it was Lyman Draper, the Draper manuscripts that are all up in Wisconsin, and Draper kind of gobbled up other manuscripts like Reverend Shane, who was coming through Northern Kentucky and the Cincinnati area in the 1820s and 30s, and getting just taking down oral histories of people who were alive and in the area in the frontier. So those documents, whether it's those documents or the Torrance papers that are in the Cincinnati Historical Society, or actually there used to be the Yateman papers in the Historical Society in Cincinnati that have been gone for over 100 years, unfortunately, because there was a lovely woman about 100 years ago, or maybe 110 or 20 years ago, that wanted to write a history of the Ohio Valley and the frontier. And she contacted the Historical Society in Cincinnati, And they were more than happy to oblige by giving her some documents so she could research it. And they loaded up the documents and sent them to where she was at, I believe, in Baltimore. And what she didn't expect is they sent her a steamer trunk full of archival documents. It was overwhelming to her. She kind of put it aside. And then unfortunately, there was a major city fire, and we've lost so many resources. And that's just one little thing that over the years we've lost so much frontier. So when you got a guy like Collins writing about the frontier, where he had possibly, if not living memory, which he wouldn't have had, but he may have known people that knew people who knew people. And they knew where maybe some of the resources were, but it was all handwritten and in libraries. Now we can find things online, and really the from a collections management and an archival perspective, this information is far more accessible now than it was even when I started getting interested in this topic 10 or 15 years ago. So we're always finding new things, whether it's, things that say the state of Virginia has put up online or otherwise. So with Colonel David Rogers' defeat, we often, and what we had often thought about it, is it happened maybe in 1779, and we're told that Rogers had been commissioned or had a military commission from Patrick Henry, the governor of Virginia, to go down to New Orleans and bring back supplies for the Continental Army in during the Revolutionary War. So that's what we knew. And what seems the records, what they had been saying is that he's coming back. So really what we knew from Draper and others is in January of 1778, he gets his commission from Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry sends him to meet with General Hand to get keelboats made to go down to New Orleans. By April of 1778, General Hand is writing Horatio Gates going, hey, I don't know what to do here. We don't have the supplies to really give David or Colonel Rogers just advise, should I be sending him down or not? Evidently, the advice was to send him downriver. So the historic record then gets a little conflated and confused from the old sources. The old sources say, he's coming back up in 1779. I start questioning that because if you're a military man and you go down to New Orleans in keelboats in 1778 and you spend a year, I don't know, hanging out in New Orleans and then come back in 1779 during the American Revolution, you're going to be coming back to a court martial at best. But what happened, or what seems to happen, is the events of Rogers' unfortunate situation have been conflated with John Campbell's. So John Campbell in 1779 had a very similar mission to go to New Orleans with keelboats, come back up with supplies for the troops. John Campbell is who Campbell County is named after. So at some point in time in the late 19th century, when there's been this mix of two very similar incidences that actually happened a year apart. The reason that what I have recently been able to find, which is really interesting, is some records from the state of Virginia that's actually Colonel David Rogers' widow applying for land grants for her husband's military service for Virginia. And she goes through this over a number of years to try to prove that he was fighting for Virginia, that he gave his life. And there's a number of accounts of people who were at the events. And they all pretty well say 1778. And they say around October. We're not real sure, but it seems to be right around the beginning of October, maybe late September. And the really interesting thing is for whatever reason, because the Campbell account actually is different than what we've been led to believe. For many years, there's been this discussion of this attack, this event happening on the sandbar at Dayton, Kentucky. So, you know, when you think about the Dayton beaches and the sandbar that exists, it's like 7 miles long along the shore at Dayton, Kentucky. And it's all the kind of the sand and the debris that's washed out of the Little Miami. And then it kind of settled on that bank. And, you know, in the early 20th century, there was amusements and a beach there. You could go swimming. So historically, there was always this sandbar there. It was a low spot, and depending on the time of the year, the river would be pretty shallow there. We hear the account that, you know, this confused account of the mixing of the Campbell and the Rogers narrative as happening potentially at that sandbar. But when you look at the historic documents, they're saying near the mouth of the Licking. So that's a problem, because if you're looking at Dayton, Kentucky, and part of the account is talking about something that happened on seeing natives crossing maybe from the Little Miami, you've got, that's not really that close to the mouth of the Licking. And otherwise they would say at the mouth of the Licking. One of the recent accounts that I found with the Campbell account that was in 1779 is saying actually at the mouth of the Mill Creek in Cincinnati when they came under attack. So there's potentially, even as I've talked about a conflated two accounts, there may actually be a third event with a different Rogers that happened near the mouth of the Little Miami, and that could have been a William Rogers, but I'm struggling to find anything with that. And that just really, as I put this together today, started to fall into this idea that there could be a third event that over the course of, you know, almost 200 years, we've conflated things that happened within a 10-year period, although two of them were within a year of each other. So the interesting thing, and the reason that I'm really interested in the Rogers defeat, is the historic accounts and the primary sources that I've been able to find are pretty clear that it was near the mouth of the Licking, which tells me if it was near the mouth of the Licking, there was a Revolutionary War battle that may have had Simon Girty or Black Kettle, I believe was the Shawnee chief, would have been part of this force that these. So what happened is Colonel David Rogers was coming back up from New Orleans. They had at least 2 keelboats. Depending on the account, because of how these things have gotten confused, there might have been a third. There were 40 to 60 men on these boats. As they came up the river at the end of September or so of 78, they happened upon seeing some natives cross into Ohio, or from Ohio into Kentucky, they believed. Being that they were frontier types, and during the war, you know, if you see natives crossing into Kentucky, you know that there's settlements in Kentucky. You're not entirely sure what they're up to. There was a concern for trying to maybe defend the Kentuckians living, if they could catch up with these natives and stop them. So they pull the keelboats in to shore. They unload about 40 men, and they come up out of the river valley. If you figure September, the water's probably fairly shallow. So they come up out of the valley, get up out kind of into the floodplain, and they realized quickly that there wasn't just 10 or 15 natives, but there were about 200. And they were pretty handily defeated. Maybe 13 people survived. And they lost, I believe the keelboats were taken. What's interesting is those accounts, there are some sources that Colonel David Rogers' wife used, people who were there, who talk about how he had been wounded. He had been shot in the stomach, I believe. The other man, he and another man were hiding from the natives through the night. The other man had been shot in the shoulder or the arm. And at some point in time of the night, the other man knew that Rogers wasn't going to make it, and he needed to leave. And he finds his way to Louisville. So what I've been trying to understand is, if this battle happened, and it didn't necessarily happen in Dayton, Kentucky, where did it happen? If it was near the mouth of the Licking, which all the primary sources seem to say it was, then it's either Newport or Covington. Within this last week or so, thinking about if you're wounded and you're trying to escape from a hostile force, I am leaning towards we may have had a Revolutionary War battle fought in Covington, Kentucky. And that's something that I would love to prove. There's a lot of history now. Now you may wonder, as I initially did, well, why 1778 instead of 79? And also, why were there so many natives at the mouth of the Licking at the time that these men were coming back upriver? And at the end of 1778, there's a lot going on. There's a whole lot going on in the Revolutionary War. George Rogers Clark has already kind of taken Kaskaskia. In September of 1778, there was the siege at Boonesboro, which ended sometime, the natives gave up the siege sometime around the 20th or maybe the 27th, sometime in that 7-day period. Most armies, both native and colonial armies, when going into Ohio or coming into Kentucky, they almost always met at the mouth of the Licking. So if you think about the army leaving Boonesboro and they're coming back into the Ohio territory and back into Ohio, they would have followed the Licking and came right up to the Licking, to the mouth of the Licking. It just so happens that right at that same time, you've got Colonel David Rogers, who is also, by the way, the cousin of George Rogers Clark. Colonel David Rogers kind of coming up the river with his keelboat. They see some natives, they come across. So you had this, it was just a serious, it was a serious mistake. And that's why I call it mistakes. There was a serious mistake that was made, underestimating and not having the full knowledge of what was going on. And within, it's an interest, as I said, that whole time period is fascinating because you've got the siege of Boonesboro, the ending of the siege at Boonesboro. You've got Rogers' defeat right in that same time period. And really within just a week or a few days is when Simon Kenton is captured and has to go through his gauntlets. So there's all of this really amazing history that's happened along the Ohio Valley that's all kind of tied together within Boonesboro and these attacks and counterattacks in this frontier war during the American Revolution. So Rogers' defeat is one of these things where I really want, really I would be just as excited if I could prove that it was in Campbell County on the beaches at Dayton, Kentucky, as I would if I can say it's completely in Covington or if it's in Newport, because there's this Revolutionary War history that we don't fully understand, and it's hard to understand because the documents are, it maybe not lost to history, but they've been dispersed. So here, of course, is Boonsboro. And that's kind of, so if you think about the defense of that particular site, and then the native forces moving from that attack along the river and coming down, and then Rogers just kind of having a bad day. He thought he was doing good. He was coming back, and there was all of this intrigue in the frontier as you get into it. And today I've been trying to have a good, clear idea to tell you folks, but it is a really fascinating bit of history. But the more I read about it, the more I learn. I think what we have is over 100 years ago, we have a confusion of what was going on. And we get, this is a wonderful image actually from a children's or a youth book of the siege or the battle at Boonesboro. Nice, less than friendly image, but it's a good image of kind of frontier folks and native conflict. And of course, Boonesboro didn't happen quite like that, but your 19th century or early 20th century engravers had a little bit of a mind of their own. But all of that history in the frontier is really a fascinating thing. So I think there's this that we've got multiple stories that through the scope of time have gotten confused. And I would love to get to the bottom of it. And it's something that you find as I don't know how many of you get to kind of delve into history and do research. And unfortunately, as I said earlier, I don't have the ability to just kind of sink my teeth into one topic. I'm always bouncing around. But Rogers' defeat is one that I keep coming back to. And this next little story is another one that I keep coming back to. I just want to share with you this was kind of my dividing in the story slide. And this is the cane breaks. When we think about Kentucky and Kentucky and the cane breaks that you always hear about in the frontier, whether it's Daniel Boone or Kenton or somebody hiding in the tall river cane. This is an early 19th century image of the cane breaks, and it's kind of great. You see the guys riding the horses, and they're wearing kind of federal, probably post War of 1812, but federal period top hats and things. Can you imagine nowadays going through parts of Kentucky with bamboo basically that is that tall? It's just such an amazing thing to think that was part of our terrain, and we don't really see that anymore. So it's just one of the things that I love sharing that image. This actually came from another passion of mine. This was in a scrapbook of a early scientist / curator of one of the first museums in our region. And his name was Joseph Dorfoy, and this was in his scrapbook, which was actually displayed in the sanitary fair and during the Civil War as a kind of fundraising to help veterans. So there's lots of fun history that I easily sink my teeth in and jump around at. And I wanted to show what I think is a wonderful Kentucky image with the cane breaks.
Hey, Jason, can I ask you a quick question about the cane breaks? Because I find this totally fascinating, and I'm a bit of a plants hobbyist. And first of all, those just are so tall. And do we think that they really were that tall? That's my first question. And then I have a second question.
I do think they were really that tall. They were
Wow.
in excess of, I think, 30 feet tall, a lot of them.
Wow, that's
And there's still a handful of places where you can see it.
yeah.
And the river cane is also, there's some frontier reference to a type of cane that was probably called beargrass. That's why we have Beargrass Creek around Louisville. And some of the early, one of the early, probably the earliest food stuff that I can prove that was eaten in Columbia on the Cincinnati side of the river was a mixture of bad cornmeal and the root of beargrass. And it took me years to figure out that it was probably the river cane.
Wow. So, okay. So the next question, actually, I have another question that I'm just going to go ahead and ask you if you don't mind. But my second question is, I have heard, and not with really any evidence to back it up, that one of the reasons that we don't really have any cane today, like I'm sure there's a lot of reasons, right? But that some of the pioneers and settlers certainly cut down a lot of the cane and eliminated it because they did feel like it was a security issue with Native Americans. Do you have any idea? Is that really what happened? Or is that something you've ever heard of?
I haven't heard of it. From the perspective of trying to place myself in the shoes of frontier folks, I could see where that would be an argument, but it's also, it's a wetland where this cane grows, and it's going to, if you drain it and you can farm it.
Right. That's a really good point, right? That it just, from a development standpoint, it's not really conducive, right?
Right. Well, and the root of the cane is going to be far less difficult to get rid of than tree roots when you're felling trees. And in the frontier, those first settlers, they're planting, they're girdling, they're coming in, and this is another rant, but they come in the late winter and they girdle the trees to keep them from putting the leaves out. And they get their wooden plows that they're making, and they're planting their crops in between the trees that they've just killed, in just the leaf matter and that just leaf matter. Then they go and they kind of clear enough to build a first cabin. And they build that cabin, and they any of the brush they're using, they're building brush fences. And if they're moving in with groups of people, that's when they really work on stockades and things for defense. But it takes years to really retrofit the land to be good farmland when you're really felling trees. And that's also one of the things a lot of people, including Abraham Lincoln's ancestors and father and stuff, would come in, build an early cabin to improve the land, sell that for more money than what he had, buy more land further west, improve that, sell that, move further west, get more and more land. It was a way to gain wealth.
Gotcha. That's interesting. And I know you've got another story to tell us, but just the last question I have before you move on is, you had mentioned a particular person, I think, that had a scrapbook of sorts. And I was wondering, we had a question, if you can say the name again, I will type it in the chat.
The scientific scrapbook belonged to Joseph Dorfoy. And Joseph Dorfoy, after 1823, he took over the Western Museum, which the Western Museum Society in 1818 said, we're going to open up a museum in Cincinnati. It took them 2 years to gain a collection. They had a number of curators. They had people like John James Audubon working one way or another for them. We're not real sure if they were paid. But Joseph Dorfoy came up from New Orleans, and he was a consummate scientist and fascinated in all kinds of things. He's, very much like great kind of figures that we think about in Kentucky, like Constantine Rafinesque. There's wonderful science and museum history in our region, and it's probably a whole different presentation at some point in time because
Yeah.
our region has had museums in it since 1819.
Oh,
The
wow.
Western Museum didn't get started until 1820, but there was a man named John Linton that opened up a museum in 1819. And there was even things like in 1818, there was people displaying an African lion in a cage on Water Street in Cincinnati. So we've
Wow.
had this interest in science and history, and even within our story at Behringer-Crawford, when you look at something like Big Bone Lick, one of the other things, and this is a side story I'm just going to briefly touch upon, when Christopher Gist was traveling down the Ohio, doing some early surveying in 1750-51. He meets up, he really wanted to go to Big Bone Lick. And you got to understand, Big Bone Lick had only really been known of by Europeans within 7 or 8 years. It was in the early, I think like 1742 or so, that the French figured out about Big Bone Lick. So Gist, this is like 51. This is within a 10-year period. And it's like it's late winter of 51. And he meets up with a couple of guys at the mouth of the Great Miami River because he realizes that there's too many, what he's calling French Indians, around Big Bone Lick at that time. It's Ottawa and other French allied native peoples. So he can't go in there because it's too dangerous for him. But he meets with some long hunters, and one of them gives him a 4-pound tooth to take back to Virginia with him. And the man that gave him that is a man named Hugh Crawford. So one of my little mysteries, history mysteries, is Hugh Crawford in 1751 or so had this tooth that gave to Christopher Gist. Ellis Crawford, in around 1959, finds a woolly mammoth, or a mastodon lower jawbone, which was one of the major reasons why Big Bone Lick becomes a state park in Kentucky. And also Ellis was really pushing for that prior to that. So is Hugh Crawford related to Ellis Crawford, and have the Crawfords had this history with Big Bone Lick for almost 250 years? Just
Oh, wow. That's
just a little
interesting.
something I've tried to figure out and don't have the time to go for. It's a side history mystery for you.
Well, I know we have a lot of genealogy, we'll say aficionados here in this group. So maybe somebody in their spare time can check it out. All right, I'm going to let you move on. I know I got you distracted, but I was
no, it's okay. That's what this whole presentation is about. So we've got this handsome bloke here, John Filson. And Filson, in Kentucky, we've got the Filson Society. It's our historical society. John Filson really wrote one of the first histories. In 1784, he comes up with a map of Kentucky, and he's the man that's credited to making Daniel Boone famous. So Filson's history is a fascinating one, and I started going down that rabbit hole a little more today, trying to prepare for this. And he's a fascinating man, an educated man that did a lot in the state. But Filson meets an unfortunate demise that we're not real sure exactly what happened. John Filson, who was friends or acquainted with Colonel Robert Patterson, he and Patterson and Matthias Denman, who was from New Jersey, contracted with John Cleve Sims in 1778 or 1788. So roughly 10 years after the Rogers defeat thing, to purchase the land, roughly that first section, which is a section is 1 square mile, 640 acres of land right across from the mouth of the Licking River in what would become Cincinnati. Filson is attributed to giving it its first name, which was Lasantaville, even though I have seen in historic records, at one point in time, he was toying with the name Lasantaburg. So kind of German instead of French, which is interesting. Filson was a surveyor, and he, amongst all of his other trades. So Denman, he was an author and a surveyor, and when you look at the partnership between Denman, Patterson, and Filson, Filson was going to bring a lot to the table because they were all contracting in this kind of land speculation deal to create a town at the mouth of the Licking, but on the Cincinnati or the Ohio side, and to sell it and make lots of money. So if you needed a guy to spin a good yarn, it was John Filson. You needed a guy to lay out the streets, it was John Filson. So it was around September of 1788. And kind of later in September, Filson was meeting with Denman and Patterson at the mouth of the Licking. They were crossing into Ohio. They first went, I believe, to the east and then to the west and worked their way up into what would become the Miami Purchase or the Sims Purchase. Within a few days, they get further enough up. They're just doing kind of rough. I mean, they'd kind of laid out or had a pretty good idea what they were going to lay out the town of Lasantaville would be like. So then they were, Sims and others, they were pushing further and further north into what would be the Miami Purchase. Sims writes in his, actually it was by October, I'm trying to remember the date, of 1788. John Cleve Sims is back in Limestone or Maysville, and he's writing Jonathan Dayton about what happened. And as his account, which differs from the Denman Patterson account, Sims' account is they got sufficiently far inland from the Ohio River that the party with the Kentuckians and Denman and others had came across a native camp, maybe a hunting camp. The Kentuckians were pretty well set on waiting and ambushing the natives because it was a fairly recently used camp, because they didn't trust that the natives weren't in Kentucky stealing horses or taking captives or attacking someplace. Sims and Denman, but probably more Sims than Denman, being from New Jersey, were not used to frontier life and the conflict that there was. And Sims is like, these people are going to be our neighbors. We need to be friendly with them. This upset the Kentuckians. So there was and this is in Sims' account. And I'm trying to remember the date. It's later in October of 1788 that Sims is writing this to Dayton. But the Sims account says the Kentuckians abandoned him, and shortly thereafter, Filson was killed by a single Indian, but they never found his body. The Denman Patterson account is a little different. There's still all of the parties involved that were there claimed that Filson went missing, presumed killed by an Indian or Indians, and they never found his body. What they did manage to do is divide up all his stuff, because later, much later, in fact, there's a book written in the 19th century about John Filson, And some of the sources that the author's using are, there was probably one of the last things Filson wrote was a poem, maybe about Louisville. And this came from a man named Americus Sims, who was the son of John Cleave Sims Jr., who was Major John Cleave Sims Jr., who's actually the nephew of John Cleave Sims. John Cleave Sims Jr., fascinating guy. He's the guy that was going around in the early 19th century trying to convince the US government and others to fund an expedition to the North Pole so he could go inside the earth, because he was a proponent of Edmund Haile and the hollow earth theory. So John Cleave Sims Jr., there's an early 19th century book written called Simsonia that's a hollow earth thing. I can go into detail about that, but we're not going to, because we want to talk about Filson. Filson, shortly after, I think the 4th of October, there's a snippet of an account that I read where Denman's writing to Patterson. And it's pretty brief, and it's hard not to read into because it's brief and you just want to know what's going on. Denman lays out that, I think he wrote to Patterson, what happened to Filson. And then within a few short lines, he's saying to Patterson, you owe me $50. That would be really easy to read into, but because the three men, Filson, Patterson, and Denman, were they were equally involved in purchasing the land from Sims, but Denman was the first guy that contracted. These other two guys kind of came in on the contract. So what that was really more about is that Denman needed Patterson to give him the other money. Now, whatever happened to Filson, the party shortly replaced him with Israel Ludlow. And Israel Ludlow was a pretty important surveyor in the region. And I believe he's also the man that surveyed the Treaty of Greenville line in 1795 or 1794, I think, right in that period. So Ludlow becomes the new Filson in the venture to create this town that originally was called LaSanteville. My problem with the killed by a native account, a single Indian, and never found his body, is why would have they hidden his body? And how did they know? If you never find his body, how do you know? And this kind of mystery actually is a fun thing that later in regional history, in Cincinnati's regional history, in 1859, there's a German newspaperman and author named Emil Klepprich that writes a book called Mysteries of the West that has to do with all of these early issues with who owns the land in LaSanteville, because it took years for the whole Cincinnati, who had the land. There was, because the military grants and things with Harmer and potentially Filson, there was all of these land speculation arguments and court cases for years into the 19th century about who owned property in this increasingly valuable growing city. So Emil Klepprich writes this book, Mysteries of the West, and part of that story is under the premise that Filson never died, but he was captured by natives. He went native and had native heirs who would have inherited the lands that would have been his, that he had already paid for in what is now Cincinnati. Klepprich is by no means a reliable source. He is he's just an author, and there's a lot of our regional history stories that go back to the frontier that can pretty well, that are complete myths that have been translated out of Kleprick's kind of fabrications in the middle of the 19th century. But it's an interesting premise that even in that 1850 period, people were wondering what happened to John Filson. Now, I believe, and my take on Filson, and we can change to the Filson map if you'd like. My take on Filson is he had a very storied history. He was involved in possibly some land speculation in Illinois, where the entire party except him got wiped out. Within months before the venture into Ohio, where he lost his life, he was involved in multiple lawsuits in Kentucky. He's a very interesting character in our history. So there were people that may not have liked Filson. He may have had, he barely survived his other venture into I believe, Illinois. So when Filson and this party come across a pretty recent native camp, and there's people getting excited, and there's dispute over what to do about this group or this hunting camp, there's a number of possibilities. You could think, well, maybe Filson was suffering from post-traumatic stress, because he really had real issues, as I understand his story, with what had happened earlier. There's also just everybody's excited and excitable. So if everybody's nervous and they think they're going to be attacked at any moment, is it possible that Filson wasn't killed by a native, but he went into the woods to survey or use the restroom or whatever, and he comes traipsing back in, and maybe Sims or somebody who's just a little not used to frontier life, or even one of the Kentuckians that are just, they get a little trigger happy, they accidentally shoot him. The whole idea of that they never found his body, even years later as they looked for him, that there was never anything of his found. But what he did have on his person, what he had with his horse and stuff, or divided up again amongst the group, is highly questionable. Because if you look later at, say, within a year, in the winter of 1789-90 in Columbia, along the Little Miami near where Lincoln Airport is now, there's accounts of that group of folks were really holed up in their stockade. And if you went out to hunt, you could easily be attacked and killed. And actually the native folks were displaying and leaving the body to be found, if not just on the ground, maybe put on a pole or something. So there was really there's no reason that any native, even earlier, had to hide a body. Why are you hiding a body? So it's really kind of an interesting story in our history. So for me, the death of John Filson in northern Kentucky North is really the first unsolved murder mystery for our region. I think that it could have been an accident. As I read some of these lawsuits and stuff, maybe somebody didn't like him. He was occasionally a little pushy, even with Patterson. But they quickly replaced him. I think he had probably already exchanged money. So somebody's benefiting from that. And he was quickly replaced. And it's a really weird story. Now, I once asked this story of this book here is a good, and an out of print story book called Stockades in the Wilderness, written by John Steinley and Richard Scammyhorn. And it's all about some of the early fortifications in the Cincinnati area. When Richard Scammyhorn was still alive, I had a few phone conversations with him, and I posed this question to him. Because guys like Steinley and Scammyhorn were asking the same questions I am now, but 30 years ago. And I have no desire to reinvent the wheel if I can find somebody that actually invented it first and has the answers. So I asked Richard Scammyhorn, and unfortunately at the time his health was failing. And he said, I know who killed John Filson. And I said, great, can you tell me? And he said, I'll tell you when I feel better. And then unfortunately, he had the nerve to die. And it's unfortunate because I would have really loved to meet the man, but he took that story with him to his grave. And it's been hard for me not to hold that as a grudge against him. John Steinley is in Colorado, and I don't know that I'll ever be able to talk to him, but I may reach out to him here, or try to soon. Maybe he will know the answer. But we have really kind of what I wanted to share with you, and I don't know where we are on time.
You're fine. We got a couple more. We got like 5 more minutes.
5 more minutes. So in conclusion, and then we can answer questions if there are. I wanted to share with you some of the mysteries that have kind of been eating, the little things that have been eating at my brain for quite some time. It's fun. You know, I enjoy my job as a curator. I get to kind of dive into these things that hopefully I can find an answer for, and they're exciting to me. Some of them I have to put on the shelf for years, and really the death of John Filson is one that I just occasionally come back to, dig a little more, find something new. I've been wondering about Rogers' defeat actually for a long time, because I first, or fairly recently, well, at some point in time, I found this little pamphlet, or was given this little pamphlet from another late historian friend of mine. And this was from the Anderson Township Historical Society, and it references Rogers' defeat in Ohio, which at the mouth of the Little Miami. And at the time, I'm like, what is there? I don't know. And that, re-looking at that recently is now why I'm starting to think there may have been another Rogers defeat, because the times, there's all of these things they don't add up real well. So we've got multiple stories. It's a fun mystery, but our history here in Northern Kentucky and along the Ohio Valley is so rich, and there's so many layers of it. And, you know, it's about the story. It's about the people and their experiences. And we think about, you know, the native and frontier conflict, and it was so kind of nasty and violent, and people didn't understand each other, and there were all these cultural differences. And it was vindictive, and it's just this. I'm so thankful I don't live in that time period. I don't see well enough to have survived more than a day. You know, I would have long since lost my hair in some conflict one way or another. The other fun thing that is just a side note that I often think about in our frontier period is anything before the Treaty of Greenville that happened bad in the frontier along the Ohio River was attributed to native attack. Right after the Treaty of Greenville, there's a whole lot of river pirates. And these people, this conflict, there was this whole conflict along the frontier that there were places, there were settlements, there were things here that we don't know about. And until you get into those 18th century documents, you don't see them. You hear there's references to them with somebody like Christopher Gist or others. There's little settlements. There's single cabins and little taverns here or there. There were river pirates before the Treaty of Greenville. There were these gangs of murderous outlaws that are existing on the fringe of society, that are contributing to some of that conflict with native and settlers. They're kind of playing both sides. And there's so much history here that's just fun to delve into. So I wanted to share with you folks
Love it.
so much of this and wanted to kind of get you stuck in the quagmire of history. I know there's another slide here that
There's one more. Yes, there is
one more slide. Yes. I just wanted to welcome you to, as I said, the quicksand of history mysteries, and I'm happy that you're all part of it. And I hope I may have inspired some of you to delve into some of these stories, because I think the only way that we'll ever really be able to find answers is kind of crowdsourcing the knowledge. So many times one person has spent a lifetime and may have the answers, but if we can't find that person, we'll lose it.
Yeah, it's so true, Jason. And I just absolutely am fascinated by this story. I have we've got a couple questions, not a ton, and we are almost out of time. But I did want to ask, and Yvonne has a question too. So just really quickly, the picture that we showed, and I can go back to it. This map, I mean, this map is spectacular, right?
That is the Filson map. Yes.
If somebody theoretically wanted to print a copy of this, is there a place that our viewers could see this themselves?
I got that off of the Library of Congress site today.
Perfect. It's always good to know the sources, right? And I will say just really briefly, and I put this in the chat already, that the book that you referenced, the Stockades of the Wilderness book, I did just a very quick search as you were speaking, and so I was able to find the names, and so I put that in the chat, and I did see it is actually available used, not new. Well, actually new, it's available for $95 on Amazon, but it is available used for $21, which is, much more reasonable.
It's my copy is one I barely open because it's like new. The older ones tend to fall apart, but it is a tremendous resource. Although I will tell you, from going through some of the other accounts, the Draper accounts and stuff, there's a lot of little stockades that are not referenced in this account.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And there's so much history. Sometimes it's just fascinating.
So a couple more questions, and this is going way back to the beginning of your presentation. That very cool, and actually I'm going to stop sharing so we can see your face here. That very cool picture of the keel boat at the beginning.
Yes.
Is that from a BCM?
Yes. That I took that as a picture. There's a model of keel boats. There's actually it's one keel boat. I took a couple of angles from it. It's in a case right now, though I'm going to probably be moving that case tomorrow. So it is a model of a keel boat that we have here in the museum.
Very cool. And then let's see, Yvonne's question, which is a great question. Did the Native Americans record their history or point of view on events that we kind of consider our history? So what she says is, for example, is there a Native American account of the siege of Boonesboro? I love that question.
It is a very good question, and I have yet to find good references to that. Most Native accounts were not written down. They were oral histories or other things. There's always, maybe some of those were recorded, especially since at that point in time, the Native peoples were working with the English. This is all part of kind of the Western Revolutionary War. So there may be some accounts there. I believe Simon Girty was part of that attack. Um, so Simon Girty, it's either Blackfish or Black Kettle. I always get those two Shawnee chiefs confused in my mind. And they so there are probably some references, not necessarily written down by a native person. Really, because most native cultures didn't have a written language, and even when you start getting like the Cherokee came up with a written language in, I think, the 1790s, was something that their principal chief Sequoyah, who was actually the grandson of Christopher Gist, as a side note, uh, came up with, and within a decade, the Cherokee were literate in both English and in Cherokee, and could read their own language. It's a pretty fascinating story. At that point in time, maybe their stories were being written down, but a lot of the Ohio tribes, the Ohio Native tribes, from whether it's the Shawnee or the Miami or the Lenape people, the Delaware, or the Wyandotte, or the Mingo, or some of the you're just occasionally get stories written down from their perspective.
Yeah.
Other times you don't.
Yeah. No, I know that's a big challenge, but I love the question, and certainly something that you talk about crowdsourcing that, maybe in journals or maybe something like that, as hopefully people find more things that we can continue to share those with the community. Jason, we're out of time, but this has been so much fun. And I love the idea, I feel like I never was really into history until, really not that long ago in comparison, because it kind of felt like this thing that was static. And I love your presentation because it really shows us that history is always changing, right? A little bit. I know that sounds crazy. Like, obviously it's already happened, but our understanding of exactly what happened is evolving as we get more information. So I just want to say thank you.
Well, and it's always about the story and understanding. It's hard for us sometimes to look at it and displace ourselves from our modern perspective. But the more we understand it, the more story. History is a fascinating thing, and it's we're humans. We're always going to have some story, and it's a fun thing.
I love it. Well, thank you again, and just for our audience to know, Jason just did this heroic effort to get this together for us. And so I just want to say thank you again. And thanks to all of you for joining us. We appreciate it. Sorry we went over time just a little bit. Next week, we will be highlighting the history of the CVG airport and, all the craziness about how we have the Kenton County Airport Board, which is technically in Boone County, and all those fun details. So join us next week to learn all about the airport. And Jason, I'm sure I will see you soon, and I hope to see all of the rest of you too. Take care. Good night.